So what I would like to talk about tonight is more than just the resolution about the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I would like to talk about leadership, and specifically leadership within the context of what is going on in the world today. Now, at the beginning of 2022, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for an avalanche of action to deal with the global challenges that we were facing that were going to require the cooperation from every country on the planet. And he called for this avalanche of action before Russia invaded Ukraine and the world's attention shifted to war. And now we're at a pivotal moment, I believe, in history. We are at a moment in which the decisions that our world leaders make and the very words that they choose to use are going to take us down one path or the other. And so my question for tonight is, how can Rotary have the greatest impact in shifting our planet along the mutually assured survival path of peace? And what concrete, doable actions could Rotary take to help move us in that direction? So before we get into this, I have a couple of questions, quick questions for you to answer for yourselves. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you desire world peace? And by world peace, I mean the absence of the use of war, any war, as a means of resolving conflict. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how probable do you think it is that we will achieve world peace? And finally, do you believe that there is such a thing as a just war, circumstances under which war can be justified? Now, we'll come back to those questions in a moment, but I'd like you to just take a few seconds to cast your minds back to 1945 with the formation of the United Nations. Rotarians were there, and the sense of hope and possibility because they were going to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. And the very first resolution that they passed, resolution number 1, called for the elimination of nuclear weapons. And around the same time, UNESCO was being formed as well. And again, Rotarians were there. And UNESCO was going to promote world peace and security, not through the barrel of a gun, but through education and arts and sciences, because they knew that wars don't begin as a dispute over territory or a need for oil. Wars begin in the minds of men and women. And it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So that was the dream, that was the vision in 1945. Save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, eliminate nuclear weapons, shift the minds of men and women to peace. And so I ask you now, 75 years later, how do you think we are doing? And it's kind of a rhetorical question, isn't it? Because we're all going to say not very well. We're watching the tragedy unfold in Ukraine, the horror of the war, and we have actually heard a world leader threaten to use nuclear weapons publicly. And it's not just the tragedy in Ukraine. Only a few months ago, we were watching tragedy unfold in Afghanistan, and people so desperate to get out of the country, they were clinging to the undercarriage of airplanes. And in the meanwhile, continuing unabated is the tragedy going on in Yemen, what the United Nations calls the single largest humanitarian disaster since it was formed. And so really, and for 84 million refugees whose lives have been disrupted by war and even stolen from them. So really, it's been tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And we don't realize in the Western world that there have been 250 major wars, 250, since the United Nations pledged to save us from the scourge of war. We don't realize that. We don't recognize that war is a #1 contributor to the climate crisis, the very dire situation we're in right now with the climate. And we don't recognize the trillions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, our money, that is going into war and the preparations for war. So I ask you another question. How did this happen? How did this happen? And I'll tell you how I think it happened. I think it happened because we never believed the vision in the first place. And I'll prove it to you. At the same time as the United Nations was being formed, the countries of the world, 196 of them, were getting together to form the Geneva Conventions. The laws of armed conflict, international laws of armed conflict, rules of what can and can't be done in war. So think about this from a consciousness point of view. On the one hand, we're going to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But on the other hand, here are the rules for what you can and can't do with war. And I put it to you that there was never even a shred of a possibility that we were going to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war when we were already planning what you could and couldn't do in the next war. Let me put it to you this way. Do we have international humanitarian laws for slavery? Do we say, hey, slavery is bad, we prefer you didn't do it, but if you give your slaves a day off a week and you limit the workday to 10 hours and you allow them freedom of choice for their religion, then it's okay? We would be horrified at the idea of saying that. Horrified. And yet that is what we have done with regard to war. Now, I can understand the thinking back at the end of the Second World War around this, but wouldn't you agree with me that today, 75 years later, we are living in a completely different world? We have international laws and a court of justice and the World Bank. None of that was there in 1945. We know now the power of nonviolence. Research has shown that it's twice as likely to be successful as violent resistance. And without death and destruction that comes from war, we have the examples of Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Today, you can get a PhD in conflict resolution. None of this was available, this knowledge, at the end of the Second World War. We have the women's movement, we have the explosion of information and communication that came with the internet. And wouldn't you agree that we have evolved along with these developments? Except that when it comes to war, we are locked in a World War II mentality, the exact same way of thinking as was present in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. We still believe that security comes from the barrel of a gun. And we still accept the military dogma that we are being told, if you want peace, plan for war, build up your military. That's the way to peace. And what are we hearing from our world leaders as a response to what's happening in Ukraine? I'm not hearing a whole lot of reflection on the fact that it is militarism that has brought us to this point in the first place. What I am hearing is more militarism. Russia invaded Ukraine, therefore Canada must get its defense budget up to 2% of its GDP. Countries must beef up their military. That's what I'm hearing. And that is precisely what is bringing us to this point. So I come back to the way you are thinking. And I'd be willing to bet that when I asked you on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you desire world peace, you said 10. And I imagine you'd said that because survey after survey all around the world shows that everyone, after life itself, wants peace. But I would also bet that when I asked you the probability of our achieving that, your estimate was considerably less than 10. I know when I asked Anne that, she said 3. And I would also speculate that when I asked you if you believed in a just war, you would probably say, yes, I know I did when I was first asked that question. I thought immediately of the Second World War. We had to stand up to Hitler, right? And I forgot how much we have evolved and that we live in a completely different world today. So another way of looking at this is this. Wars are made by cultures that celebrate or tolerate war. Our thinking is reflected in our culture. Our culture is reflected in our thinking. So let me just use Canada as an example. We are one of the 10 most peaceful countries in the world, according to the Institute of Economics and Peace. So do you think Canadian culture tolerates war? Well, we host the largest trade show for the military every year in Canada, and delegations come from around the world to buy fighter jets and tanks and machine guns and ammunition. We don't just participate in the international arms trade, we facilitate the international arms trade. And we've been called out by Amnesty International because we continue to sell tanks to Saudi Arabia, and we have no integrity, really. We're an anti-nuclear country, and yet we refuse to sign the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So yes, regretfully, my country, my peaceful country, is a country that tolerates war. And if our country tolerates war, think about the other 190 countries around the world that aren't one of the 10 most peaceful countries. So let's look at Rotary culture. Do you think Rotary culture tolerates war? And you're going to say, my God, why is she asking me this question? Our foundational value in Rotary is peace. We study peace, we understand peace. We know what needs to be in place for peace to be sustainable. We are proud of the fact that our 7 areas of focus are building positive peace around the world. So what does she mean? Well, I ask you this question. If we focus only on positive peace, if we don't also work for actual peace, ending war, in fact, if we don't even use the word war in Rotary Action Group for Peace circles, as if it doesn't even exist, and if we remain unaware, blissfully unaware of the attitudes and the institutions, the structures and the systems that are keeping war happening, doesn't that make us a culture that tolerates war? Another way of looking at it, I have been to dozens of Rotary Peace conferences in the last few years, and I have found them all inspirational and wonderful, truly. And typically they have begun with the question, what is peace to you? And what is peace to you? And typically the answers have been, peace to me is knowing I can walk because I've been given a prosthetic limb. Or peace to me is knowing I have food on the table for my children. Nobody ever says peace to me is knowing that when I go to sleep at night, the bombs aren't going to fall and murder me. And in fact, what we say in Rotary circles is, instead of simply trying to stop direct violence, as if that were somehow beneath us, we focus on building positive peace. And I love our focus on positive peace and the efforts that we're doing around positive peace. But I remind you of the 84 million people disrupted by war. And I want to introduce you to Beria, Hisham, Cedra, and Judy. This is the Syrian refugee family that my family helped sponsor to come to Canada. And here we are in our backyard when they came up to visit for a long weekend. And one night after the children had gone to bed, Hisham started talking about the journey that led them out of Damascus. And he, for weeks, had been saying to Beria, we've got to leave, we've got to leave. And she had said, no, we can't leave. Our life is here. My parents are here, my brothers and sisters, my whole family, your whole family, we can't leave. And then one night the bombs fell on their street and the entire family was huddled under the stairwell into the basement. And Hisham was spreading his body over his wife and daughters as if he could give them another layer of protection. And he said, Beria, I am begging you, please let me try and save our children. And she nodded her head. And the next day they got in their car, which miraculously still worked, drove around the debris out of Damascus on a journey that was going to take them 2 years to come to Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. Now, if you ask them and the other 84 million people like them, 84 million, what is peace to you? They are going to say that it's knowing the bombs aren't going to drop. This is the number one foundational, has to be in place for there to be peace. This is a picture that was sent to them of their street after they left. So here's another way of looking at this when I talk about tolerating war. Let's take our numbers from the Institute of Economics and Peace and put the amount of money that's going into humanitarian effort on the left side of our scale and the amount of money that's going into militarism on the right side of our scale. And we know that $80 billion a year are going into humanitarian efforts. This is huge, and this speaks to the generosity of so many. But we also know from the Institute of Economics and Peace that $5.9 trillion are going into militarism. This is the cost of militarism every year worldwide. Now, I have a degree in math and physics, but you don't need a degree in physics to know which way these scales are going to go. It is simple gravity. And it's not rocket science to understand that the only way we're going to be able to make an impactful difference is if we can shift some of this money from militarism to peace. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we shift our thinking so that we no longer tolerate war. So I ask you again, do you think Rotary culture tolerates war? And do you think that Rotary should work for actual peace as well as positive peace? And what if we did? What if we resolved to stop tolerating war? What if we did everything in our power for mutually assured survival, starting with endorsing the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? Now, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons went into force in 2021 and prohibits development, testing, production, transfer, use, threat of use of nuclear weapons for the countries who have signed the treaty. And the ultimate goal is their total elimination. It helps stigmatize nuclear weapons in the same way treaties for chemical weapons and biological weapons did. And it gives a voice to the 190 countries on our planet who don't want nuclear weapons. The current status of the treaty is that it has been ratified by 60 states, 135 participated in the negotiations, and 69 nations did not vote, including all of the nuclear weapon states. So, if we were to build our resolve in Rotary and work for worldwide endorsement of the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, it's important to know that this is totally doable. There's a straightforward solution. We built these weapons, we can dismantle them. 9 countries, and this is the vision, with agreed, 9 countries could end the threat with agreed, controlled, verifiable disarmament. So what if we did everything in our power to protect this pale blue dot we call Earth? What if we endorsed the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and acted for our mutually assured survival? Now, of course, the first thing that comes up in Rotary circles is, we can't do that. That's political. We can't be political. And those of you who have heard me speak before know that I say balderdash to that. Rotarians can be brilliantly and effectively political. That is how we eliminated polio in Africa. Every strategy we used was political, advocating directly with government officials, coordinating campaigns around neighboring nations. We actually negotiated ceasefires so that we could go in and vaccinate the children. We were brilliantly political. And in fact, the empowering belief within Rotary should be that we are nonpartisan, but we can act. And this is the belief that has been shared by our president, Shekhar Mehta, who appeared on a panel on eliminating the existential threat of nuclear weapons last year in September. And he said, in my personal opinion, Rotary leaders should begin the hard work of convincing fellow Rotarians there is no cause for disagreement when it comes to nuclear weapons. We can take stronger positions for disarmament, like the International Red Cross has already done. And the International Red Cross endorsed the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons the day after it came out. Another limiting belief that I've only heard recently is we can't take a stand against nuclear weapons because there are some Rotarians who believe in nuclear weapons, and we value diversity, equity, and inclusion, and therefore cannot take a stand unless all Rotarians agree. And what I say to that one is, wait a second here, we are a democracy. And when 80–90% of Rotarians want to see something happen, we can take a stand. I mean, there are Rotarians who were anti-vaxxers, and that didn't stop us with polio. And the fact of the matter is that Rotary has already taken a stand against nuclear weapons because the Rotary Foundation came up with a new responsible investment policy last year that committed, among other things, to invest in companies deriving revenue from nuclear weapons. So we've already taken a stand against nuclear weapons. So I come back to the what if. We refuse to accept any limiting beliefs that might prevent us from doing everything in our power for mutually assured survival. This is the copy of the resolution that is going forward this year. And hopefully Many districts, including District 5000, will endorse it. Yes, a similar resolution went forward in 2020, endorsed by one district, and 30% of Rotary districts supported it. And a resolution went forward last year, endorsed by 3 districts, and 45%. The support went up by 50%. And we know we only needed 24 more districts to have voted yes for the resolution to have passed. And we know that the number one reason that the districts who voted no did so is because they looked at it and they said, this looks political. And we know that some representatives didn't even read the whole resolution. They just said, this looks political, and voted no. And we want to be more reflective now in our thinking. And so in 2022, the resolution is going forward again. There will be many more districts who are endorsing it, and we are expecting it to pass at the Council on Resolutions. There is growing momentum within Rotary, and the world wants this to happen. Poll after poll, survey after survey shows that people around the world want the TPNW to be supported and want nuclear weapons to be eliminated. And they are asking for leadership. So I asked at the beginning of this presentation, how can Rotary have the greatest impact in shifting our planet to peace? Jennifer Jones, incoming president for Rotary International, has asked us to imagine. So I ask you to imagine that by acting for mutually assured survival and endorsing the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, Rotarians could be leaders in shifting our planet toward peace. We could take up the challenge from Antonio Guterres for an avalanche of action and make this happen. Thank you.